Talk about Bob's earlier anarchy days.
Yeah, as it's been pointed out, Bob led a lot of different lives and knew different groups of people, different activist movements. The first group he got involved in, though, the first activist group he became affiliated with was the Youth International Party Yippie in Vancouver. And I met Bob. We met as Yippies a long time ago. And the thing with the Vancouver Yippies is that Vancouver is a city of protest, a city with a rich history of protest, and no activist group left more colorful protest than the Yippies of the 1970s. Actions like the Gastown Smoke-In, All Seasons Park, the Open Road newspaper, the Blaine invasion. Now, a few of you have probably heard of some of these actions, I don't know, but at the time they were very heavily publicized theatrical actions. Now, you know, there are stories about reporters falling in love with someone that they're interviewing. Bob fell in love with the social movement he was interviewing. The Yippies had created quite a profile in a really brief period of time, and he went to interview them for a feature in the Vancouver Sun, and he stayed and kept talking into the night with them. And the next day the Yippies were doing an action at Ocala Penitentiary. It was a be-out, you know, a play on the be-ins that were popular at the day. And so Bob put war paint on and joined his new friends and went to Ocala prison and participated when the Yippies tore down a fence at Ocala. And from that point on, Bob was really part of the local Yippie scene. Now, Bob, left politics wasn't entirely new to Bob. I mean, he, you know, from a young age, he'd been supportive of the new civil rights movement. And I remember him telling me as a young reporter, he'd been really deeply moved covering a speech by Stokely Carmichael. He had read Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin before he became a Yippie himself. His father had been a member of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion that fought in the Spanish Civil War, which was certainly enough to impress any Yippie anarchist in those days. So Bob already had this. Plus, the other thing, back in those days, there was quite often there were references to the people. And Bob would often say, you know, he's writing, he would say it kind of jokingly, I'm writing for the people. But he meant it, and he did it. And consistently, he, you know, not just the social movements he identified with, but anyone in BC or the Vancouver area that had any kind of progressive ideas or cause, they knew that Bob Sarti was open to it and would do what he could to get the word out. And now, part of the appeal that Bob had, and I'm talking about the Yippies as the first social movement, like Doug Sarti mentioned, he was involved in many later, but being that it was the first social movement that he was drawn to, it's good to point out some of the reasons, I think, why. And I think a lot of it is that Bob, you know, was a child of the 50s, and, you know, he loved the comedy of the 50s, the movies. He loved the Brooklyn Dodgers. He grew up loving the Brooklyn Dodgers, and doo-wop music, and just that was the cultural milieu he came out of. And the whole idea of Yippie was to combine culture with politics, to you know, organize theatrical protests mixed with serious activism. And you know, while the Yippies were dead serious about social change, also believed it could be funny and it could be fun to participate in. And that all of that kind of stuff drew Bob to it. Because Bob, for people who know Bob, I mean, one of the defining characteristics of Bob is that he was extremely funny. I mean, he had a tremendous wit. And I know years later, Bob and we worked on a publication together called The Open Road. And near the end of production, we would go into, it was downtown, second floor, next to the old Spartacus Books, our office. And the last couple of days of production, Bob and I would go into the next room, the Spartacus Books room, and sit on the couch, and we would do the headlines together. You know, we would know how many characters we needed for each headline, and we would do it for a few hours, literally. And we would go back and forth throwing one-liners at each other. And some of the stuff Bob came up was just brilliant and witty and funny, great stuff. Just for one example, we had a feature on the new, at that point, the new anti-nuclear movement, and so he came up with the headline for it, "Hell No, We Won't Glow." Which was typical Bob, you know, it's just a little play on one or two words and you've got something brilliant. And so that's just an example, but there's just a series of things like that Bob did. Now, as I mentioned, as Doug mentioned, he was a real child of popular culture as well as alternative culture. And I remember when an underground paper in Vancouver started called The Grape, I had gone over to a house in the East End to help out in production of it, and I had just gone in. I was walking through past the living room, going to the basement where they had a layout table set up, and as I went past the living room, I saw Bob sitting there staring at black and white images on a television, just glued to the television. He was the only one in the room. Everyone else was downstairs. And it was an old Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie. And Bob was just sort of completely absorbed in this Fred and Ginger dance routine. You know, he also loved baseball. Having grown up in New York, he loved the Brooklyn Dodgers and Duke Snider. And Bob and his son, Doug Sarti, inherited Bob's love of the game. And the three of us would often go down to Seattle, to the old Kingdom, to see games together. And I remember once on the way down, Bob said he had the address of a Baseball Hall of Famer in one of the small towns between Vancouver and Seattle, and that we could stop and say hi to him. And you know, Doug got very excited. He was real young. I got excited too. I mean, hell, the guy had a .318 lifetime batting average. It was Earl Averill. And so Bob, being a good reporter, had gotten his home address, and we knocked on the door. And he told us before we went there that besides being a great hitter with Cleveland, the thing he was most famous for was during an all-star game, he hit a line drive that broke a very famous pitcher's toe, Dizzy Dean, and literally ended his career. So anyway, we knock on the door, and he's being kind of polite to us, Earl Averill. And, you know, he's sort of standing there making small talk with these two hippies, a little uncomfortably. And it was kind of going nowhere until Doug finally blurted out, young Doug Sarti, who was probably about 12 years old at the time, blurted out, "Dizzy Dean's toe." And at this point, Earl became animated and suddenly became alive, and the conversation went real well after that. But, yeah, and I want to say that Doug Sarti's son Frankie, I just want to tell him that, you know, that your grandfather, Doug, I want to tell you, son, Frankie, your grandfather was a great man. But not only was he a great man, he was a good man, which might even be more important. He had a real, just in the terms of how he related to other people, you know, he had a real decency and kindness and generosity. And Bob Mercer, another Vancouver Yippie who died recently, I remember him saying to me that Bob Sarti's the Jimmy Stewart of the Vancouver Yippies. And it's true, he had that kind of, you know, gentle kind of decency to him, and he wanted to make a better world. That was the overriding thing with Bob. And I just wanted to say, like, and he expressed it in those final three works that he did, the three plays that he wrote. And in the Yippie play, he said, you know, he talked about, I was just looking here, you know, how that people have to laugh and sing and be joyous about making social change. And that to me was really the basis of everything Bob thought and did, you know. And I remember one thing we did together. Bob and I together did the last Vancouver Yippie action, or the last thing done in Vancouver under the name Youth International Party Yippie. It was 1978, and we decided to start this kind of anarchist zine called Blackout. And this was like one of the first publications of that sort. They later became very popular in a lot of cities. And so we were doing this publication called Blackout. Now, when we did the Open Road, we nicknamed it OR. So when we did Blackout, we gave it a nickname as well, based on its initials. And Bob, I remember saying to me, just before the first issue came out, he said, who do you think we say is producing this? And we named a couple of possibilities, a couple of names of collectives. And then I said, well, what about Yippie? And Bob smiled, let out a big grin, and nodded his head, yes, that's what we'll do. And then when the first issue came out, as I said, we called Open Road OR, so Blackout, he had BO. This is what he wrote in Blackout about who produced it. He said, BO, the smell of freedom, is produced by Yippies. Anyway, thank you.